Chapter 6. Clerval then put the following letter into my hands. It was from my own Elizabeth. My dearest cousin, you have been ill, very ill, and even the consent letters of dear kind Henry are not sufficient to reassure me on your account. You are forbidden to write, to hold the pen, yet one word for you, dear Victor, is necessary to calm our apprehensions. For a long time I have thought that each post would bring this line, and my persuasions have restrained my uncle from undertaking a journey to lists. I have prevented his encountering the inconveniences, and perhaps dangers, of so long a journey. Yet how often have I regretted not being able to perform it myself. I figured to myself that the task of attending on your sick bed was devolved on some mercy old nurse, who could never guess your wishes nor minister them with the care and affection of your poor cousin. Yet that is over now. Clerval writes that indeed you are getting better. I eagerly hope that you will confirm this intelligence soon in your own handwriting. Get well, and return to us. You will find a happy, cheerful home, and friends who love you dearly. Your father's health is vigorous, and he asks but to see you, and to be assured that you are well, and not a care will ever cloud his benevolent countenance. How pleased you would be to remark the improvements of Ernest. He is now 16, and full of activity and spirit. He is delirious to be a true Swiss, and enter into foreign service, but we can part with him, at least until his elder brother returns us. My uncle is not pleased with the idea of a military career in a distant country, but Ernest never had the powers of application. He looks upon the study as an oblivious fetter. His time is spent in the open air, climbing the hills or rowing on the lake. I fear that he will become an idler, uselessly yield the point that permit him to enter on a profession which he has selected. Little alteration, except for the growth of our dear children, has taken place since he left us. The blue lake and snow-capped mountains, they never change, and I think our place at home and our content hearts are regulated by the same immutable laws. My trifling occupations take up my time and amuse me. I am rewarded for my exertions by seeing none but happy, kind faces around me. Since he left us, but one change has taken place in our little household. Do you remember on the occasion Justin Mortis entered our family? Probably you do not. I will relate her history, therefore, in few words. Madame Mortens, her mother, was a widow with 4 children, whom Justine was the third. This girl always been her favorite for father, but through a strange perversity, her mother could not endure her, and after the death of Mortens treated her very ill. My aunt observed this, and when Justin was 12 years old of age, prevailed on her mother to allow her to live at our house. The republican instructions of our country have produced simpler and happier manners than those which prevail in great monarchies that surround it. Hence, there is less distinction between the several classes of its inhabitants, and lower orders, being neither so poor nor so despised. Their manners are more refined and moral. A servant in Guienne does not mean the same thing as a servant in France and England. Justin, thus received in our family, learned the duties of a servant in a condition which, in our fortunate country, does not include the idea of ignorance and a sacrifice of the dignity of a human being. Justin, you may remember, was a great favorite of yours, and I recollect you once remarked that if you were in an ill humor, one glance from Justin would dissipate it, for the same reason that Aristo gives concerning the beauty of Angelica. She looked so frank-hearted and happy. My aunt conceived a great attachment for her, by which she was induced to give her an education superior to that which she had at first intended. This benefit was fully repaid. Justin was the most grateful little creature in the world. I do not mean that she made any professions. I never heard one pass from her lips. but you can see by her eyes that she almost adored her protectress. Although her disposition was gay, in many respects inconsiderate, yet she paid the greatest attention to every gesture of my aunt. She thought her the model of all excellence, and endeavored to intimidate her phraseology and manners, so that even now she often reminds me of her. When my dearest aunt died, everyone was too much occupied in their own grief to notice poor Justin, who had attended her illness with the most affectious affection. Poor Justin was very ill, but other trials were reserved for her. One by one her brothers and sisters died, and her mother, with the exception of her neglected daughter, was left childless. The conscience of the woman was troubled. She began to think that the deaths of her favorites were adjudged from the heaven to chastise her for partiality. She was a Roman Catholic, and I believe her confessor confirmed the idea that she had conceived. Accordingly, a few months after your departure for Iglesias, Justin was called home by her reputant mother. Poor girl, she wept when she quitted our house. She was much altered since the death of my aunt. Grief had given softness and a winning mildness to her manners, which had before been remarkable for vivacity, nor was her residence at her mother's house of a nature to restore her gaiety. The poor woman was very vacillating in her repentance. She sometimes begged Justin to forgive her unkindness, but much oftener accused her of having caused the deaths of her brothers and sister. Perpetual fretting at length knew Madame Moritz into a decline, which at first increased her irritability, but she is now at peace forever. She died on the first approach of cold weather at the beginning of this last winter. Justin has returned to us, and I assure you I love her tenderly. She is very clever and gentle and extremely pretty. As I mentioned before, her mien and her expressions continually remind me of my dear aunt. I must say also a few words to you, my dear cousin, of little darling Willem. I wish you could see him. He is very tall of his age, with sweet, laughing blue eyes, dark eyelashes, and curling hair. When he smiles, two little dimples appear on each cheek, which are rosy with health. He's already had one or two little wives, but Louisa Biron is his favorite, a pretty little girl of 5 years of age. Now, dear Victor, I dare say you wish to be indulged in a little gossip concerning the good people of Geneva. The pretty Miss Manfield has already received congratulatory visits on her approaching marriage with a young Englishman, John Melbourne. Yes, her nearly ugly sister, Manon, married M. Dulevard, the rich banker, last autumn. Your favorite schoolfellow, Louis Manor, has suffered misfortune since the departure of Clerval from Geneva. He has already conserved spirits, and is reported to be on the point of marrying a very lively, pretty Frenchwoman, Madame Tavier. She is a widow, and much older than Mior, but she is very much admired and favored with everybody. I have written myself into better spirits, dear cousin, but anxiety returns upon me as I conclude. Write, dearest Victor, one line, one word will be a blessing to us. 10,000 thanks to Henry for his kindness, his affection, and his letters. We are sincerely grateful. Adieu, my cousin. Take care of yourself, and I entreat you write. Elizabeth Lavenza, Geneva, March 18, 17. Dear Elizabeth, I explained, when I read her letter, I will write instantly and relieve them from the anxiety they must feel. I wrote, and this exertion greatly fatigued me, but my convalescence had commenced and proceeded regularly. In another fortnight I was able to leave my chamber. One of my first duties on my recovery was to introduce Clerval to the several professors of the university. In doing this, I underwent a kind of rough usage, ill befitting the wounds my mind had sustained. ever since the fatal night, and the end of my labors, and the beginning of my misfortunes. I had conceived a violent apathy, even to the name of natural physiology. When I was otherwise quite restored to health, the sight of a chemical instrument would renew all the agony of my nervous symptoms. Henry saw this, and had removed all my apparatuses from my view. He also changed my apartment, for he perceived that I had acquired a dislike for the room which had previously been my laboratory. But these cares of Clerval made of no avail when I visited the professors. M. Waldman inflicted torture when he praised, with kindness and warmth, the astonishing progress I had made in science. He soon perceived that I disliked the subject, but not guessing the real cause. He attributed my feelings to modesty and changed the subject from my improvement to the science itself, with a desire, as I evidently saw, of drawing me out. What could I do? He meant to please, and he meant to torture me. I felt if he had paced carefully one by one, in my view, those instruments which were to be afterwards used in putting me to a slow and cruel death. I writhed under his words, yet dared not to exhibit the pain I felt. Clerval, whose eyes and feelings were always quick in discerning the sensations of others, declined the subject aligning in excuse. His total ignorance, and the conversation took a more general turn. I thanked my friend from my heart, but I did not speak. I saw plainly that he was surprised, but he never attempted to draw my secret from me, and although I loved him with a mixture of affection and perseverance that knew no bounds, yet I could never persuade myself to confide to him the event in which so often present my recollection, from which I fear the detail of another would only impress more deeply. M. Kemprey was not equally docile, and in my condition at that time of almost insupportable sensitiveness, this harsh, blunt accusation he gave me even more pain than the fellow apprehension M. Waldman. "The fellow!" he cried. "Why, M. Clerval, I assure you he has outstripped us all. Aye, stare if you please, but it is nevertheless true. A youngster who but a few years ago believed in Cornelius Apricot was firmly as in the gospel, has now set himself at the head of the university, and if he is not pulled down, we shall all be out of countenance. Aye, aye," he continued, observing my face, expressive of suffering. "M. Frankenstein is modest, an excellent quality for a young man. Young men should be diffident of themselves. You know, M. Clerval, I was myself when young, but that wears out in a short time. M. Kemprey is now commenced of eulogy on himself, which happily turned the conversation from a subject that was so annoying to me. Clerval had never sympathized in my tastes for natural science, and his literary pursuits differed wholly from those which had occupied me. He came to the university with a design of making himself complete master of the Oriental languages, as thus he should open a field for the plane of life he had marked out for himself. Resolved to pursue no ignominious career, he turned his eyes towards the east as affording scope for his spirit to enterprise. The Persian, Arabic, the Sanskrit languages engaged his attention, and I was easily introduced to enter the same studies. Idleness had ever been irksome to me, and now that I wished to fly from reflection and hated my former studies, I felt greatly from beginning fellow pupil with my friend, and find not only instruction but consolation in the works of Orientalists. I did not, like him, attempt a critical knowledge of their dialects, nor did I contemplate making any other use of them that temporary amusement. I read merely to understand their meaning, and they were well repaid my labors. Their melancholy is soothing, and their joy elevating, to a degree I never experienced in studying the authors of any other country. When you read their writings, life appears to consist in a warm sun and garden of roses, in the smiles and frowns of fair enemy, the fire that consumes your own heart, how different from many in hero poetry of Greece and Rome. Summer passed away in these occupations, and my return to Gemma was fixed for the later end of autumn. But being delayed by several accidents, winter and snow arrived, the clouds were deemed impassable, and my journey was retarded until the ensuing spring. I felt this delay very bitterly, for I longed to see my native town and my beloved friends. My return had only been delayed so long from the unwillingness to leave Clerval in a strange place before he had become acquainted with any of its inhabitants. The winter, however, was spent cheerfully, and although the spring was uncommonly late when it came, its beauty compensated for its dilatoriness. The month of May had already commenced, and I expected a letter daily which was to fix the day of my departure, when Henry proposed a predestined tour in the environs of Iglis, that I might bid a personal farewell to the country I had so long inhabited. I assented with pleasure to this proposition. I was fond of exercise, and Clerval had always been my favorite champion in the rambleness of this nature that I had taken among the scenes of my native country. He passed a fortnight in these perambulations. My health and spirits had long been restored, and they gained additional strength from the salubrious air I breathed. The natural incidents of our progress, and the conservation of my friend, study and before scheduled me from the intercourse of my fellow creatures, and rendered me unsociable. But Clerval called forth the better feelings of my heart. He again taught me to love the aspect of nature in cheerful faces of children. Excellent friends, how sincerely did you love me, and endeavor to elevate my mind until it was on the level with your own. A selfish pursuit had cramped and narrowed me until your gentleness and affection warmed and opened my senses. I became the same happy creature who a few years ago, loved and beloved by all, had no sorrow or care. An happy, inanimate creature had the power of bestowing on me the most delightful sensations. A sincere sky, a verdant fields filled me with ecstasy. The present sensation was indeed divine. The flowers of spring bloomed in the hedges, while those of summer were already in bud. I was undisturbed by thoughts which during the preceding year had pressed upon me, notwithstanding my endeavors to throw them off with the invincible burden. Henry rejoiced in my gaiety, sincerely sympathizing in my feelings. He exerted himself to amuse me, while he expressed the sensations that filled his soul. The resources of his mind on this occasion were truly astonishing. His conversation was full of imagination, and very often in imitation of the Persian and Arabic writers. He invented tales of wonder and fantasy and passion. At other times he repeated any favorite poems or drew me out into arguments, which he supported with great ingenuity. We returned to our college on a Sunday afternoon. The peasants were dancing, and everyone we met appeared gay and happy. My own spirits were high, and I bounded along with feelings of unbridled joy and hilarity. Chapter 7. On my return, I found the following letter from my father. Dear Victor, you have probably waited impatiently for a letter to fix the day of your return to us, and I was at first tempted to write only a few lines, merely mentioning the day on which I should expect you, but that would be a cruel kindness, and I dare not do it. What would be your surprise, my son, when you expect a happy and glad welcome to behold, on the contrary, tears of wretchedness? And how, Victor, can I relate our misfortune? Absence cannot render you callous to our joys and griefs. And how shall I inflict pain on my long absent son? I wish to prepare you even for woeful news, but I know it is impossible. Even now your eye skims over a page to seek the words which are conveying your horrible tidings. Willem is dead, the sweet child, whose smiles delighted and warmed my heart, who was so gentle, yet so gay. Victor, he is murdered. I will not attempt to console you, but will simply relate the circumstances of the transaction. Last Thursday, May 7th, my niece and your two brothers went to walk in Plain Palace. The evening was warm and sincere, and we prolonged our walk farther than usual. It was already dusk before we thought of returning, and then we discovered that William and Ernest, who had gone on before, were not to be found. We accordingly rested on a seat until they should return. Presently, Ernest came and inquired if we had seen his brother. He said he had been playing with him, that William had run away to hide himself, and that he vainly sought for him, and afterwards waited a long time. He did not return. This account rather alarmed us. We continued to search for him until night fell, when oblivious conjectured that he might have returned to the house. He was not there. We returned again with torches, for I could not rest when I thought that my sweet boy had lost himself, and was exposed to all the damps and dews of night. Elizabeth also suffered extreme anguish. About 5 in the morning I discovered my lovely boy, whom night before I had seen blooming and active in health, stretched on grass, livid and motionless. The print of the murderer's finger was on his cheek. He was conveyed home, and the anguish that was visible to my countenance betrayed the secret to Elizabeth. She was very earnest to see the corpse. At first I intended to prevent her, but she persisted. Entering a room where it lay, hastily examined the neck of the victim, and clasping her hands, exclaimed, "O God, I have murdered my darling child." She fainted, and was restored with extreme difficulty. When she again lived, it was only to weep and sigh. She told me that same evening William had teased her to let him wear a very valuable miniature that she had possessed of our mother. This picture is gone, and was doubtless the temptation which urged the murderer to do the deed. We have no trace of him at present, although your exertions to discover him are unremitted, but they will not restore my beloved William. Come, dearest Victor, you alone can console Elizabeth. She weeps continually, and accuses herself unjustly as causes of his death. Her words pierce my heart. We are all unhappy, but will not that be additional motive for you, my son, to return, and me comforter? Your dear mother, alas, Victor, I now say, thank God she did not live to witness the cruel and miserable death of her youngest darling. Come, Victor, not brooding thoughts of vengeance against the assassin, but with feelings of peace and gentleness, will heal, instead of festering the wounds of our minds. Enter the house of mourning, my friend, but with kindness and affection for those who love you, and not with hatred for your enemies. Your affectionate and afflicted father, Alflone Frankenstein. Geneva, May 12, 17. Clerval, who had watched my countenance as I read his letter, was surprised to observe the despair that succeeded to the joy I had first expressed on receiving news from my friends. I threw the letter on the table and covered my face with my hands. "My dear Frankenstein," exclaimed Henry, when he perceived me to weep with bitterness, "are you always to be unhappy, my dear friend? What has happened?" I motioned him to take up the letter, while I walked up and down the room with extremest agitation. Tears also gushed from my eyes and from Clerval as he read the letter account of my misfortune. "I can offer you no consolation, my friend," said he. "Your disaster is irreparable. What do you intend to do?" "To go instantly to Geneva. Come with me, Henry, to order the house." During our walk, Clerval endeavored to say a few words of consolation. He could only express his heartfelt sympathy. "Poor William," said he, "dear lovely child, he now sleeps with his angel mother, who had seen him bright and joyous in his young beauty, but must weeping over his untimely loss. To die so miserably, to feel the murderer's grasp. How much more a murderer could destroy such radiant innocence? Poor little fellow! One only consolation have we. His friends mourn and weep, but he is at rest. The pang is over. His sufferings are at the end forever. A sod covers his gentle form, and he knows no pain. He can no longer be a subject for pity. We must reserve that for his miserable survivors." Clerval spoke thus as he hurried through the streets. The words impressed themselves on my mind, and I remembered them afterwards in solitude. But now, as soon as the horses arrived, I hurried into the cabriolet and bade farewell to my friend. My journey was very melancholy. At first I wished to hurry on, for I longed to console and sympathize with my loved and sorrowing friends. But when I drew near to my native town, I slackened my progress. I could hardly sustain the multiple of feelings that crowded into my mind. I passed through scenes familiar to my youth, but which I had not seen for nearly 6 years. Now altered, everything might be during that time. One sudden and desolating change had taken place, but a thousand little circumstances might have by degrees worked in other alterations, which, although they were done in more tranquillity, might not be the less decisive. Fear overcame me. I dared not advance, dreading a thousand nameless evils that made me tremble. Although I was unable to define them, I remained 2 days at less sane in this painful state of mind. I contemplated the lake. The waters were placid. All around was calm. The snowy mountains, the palaces of nature, were not changed. By degrees, the calm and heavenly scene restored me, and I continued my journey towards Genville. The road ran by a side of a lake, which became nearer as I approached my native town. I discovered more distinctly the black sides of Jura and the bright summit of Mount Blanc. I wept like a child. Dear mountains, my own beautiful lake, how do you welcome your wanderer? Your summits are clear, the sky and lake are blue and placid. Is this the prognosticed peace, or to mock at my unhappiness? I fear, my friend, I shall render myself tedious by dwelling on these preliminary circumstances. But they were days of comparative happiness, and I think of them with pleasure. My country, my beloved country, who, by native, can tell the delight I took in again beholding thy streams, thy mountains, and more than all, thy lovely lake. Yet, as I drew near home, grief and fear again overcame me. Night also closed round, and when I could hardly see the dark mountains, I felt more gloomily. The picture appeared a vast and dim scene of evil, and I foresaw obscurely that I was destined to become the most wretched of human beings. Alas, I prophesied truly, and failed only in one single circumstance, that in all the misery I imagined and dreaded, I did not conceive the 100th part of the anguish I was destined to endure. It was completely dark when I arrived in the environs of Genoa. The gates of the town were already shut, and I was obliged to pass the night at Chiron, a village at the distance of half a league from the city. The sky was serene, and, as I was unable to rest, I resolved to visit the spot where my poor William had been murdered. As I could not pass through the town, I was obliged to cross the lake in a boat to arrive at Plain Palace. During this short voyage I saw lightnings playing on the summit of Mont Blanc, in the most beautiful figures. The storm appeared to approach rapidly, and, on landing, I ascended a low hill, that I might observe its progress. It advanced, the heavens were clouded, and I soon felt rain coming slowly in large drops, but its violence quickly increased. I quitted my seat and walked on, although the darkness and storm increased every minute, and the thunder burst in a terrifying clash over my head. It was echoed from Saleve, the Juras, and the Alps of Savoy. Vivid flashes of lightning dazzled my eyes, illumining the lake, making it appear like a vast sheet of fire. Then, for an instant, everything seemed of pitchy darkness, until the eye recovered itself from the preceding flash. The storm, as is often the case in Switzerland, appeared at once in various parts of the heavens. The most violent storm hung exactly north of the town, over that part of the lake which lies between the promontory and Belvice, the village of Capet. Another storm enlightened Jura, with faint flashes, and another darkened and sometimes disclosed the mole, a peaked mountain to the east of the lake. While I watched the tempest, so beautiful yet horrific, I wandered on with hasty step. This noble war in the sky elevated my spirits. I clasped my hands and exclaimed loud, "William, dear angel, this is thy funeral, this thy dirge." As I said these words, I perceived in the gloom a figure which stole from behind a clump of trees near me. I stood fixed, gazed intently I could not be mistaken. A flash of lightning illuminated the object, and discovered its shape plainly to me, its gigantic stature, and deformity of its aspect, more hideous that belongs to humanity, instantly informed me that it was the wretch, the filthy demon, to whom I had given life. What did he there? Could he be, I shuddered at the conception, the murderer of my brother? No. Sooner did the idea cross my imagination than I became convinced of the truth. My teeth chattered, and I was forced to lean against a tree for support. The figure passed me quickly, and I lost in the gloom. Nothing in a human shape could have destroyed that fair child. He was the murderer. I could not doubt it. The mere presence of the idea was irresistible proof of the fact. I thought of pursuing the devil, but it would have been in vain, for another flash discovered him to me hanging among the rocks on the nearly perpetual ascent of Mount Slivi, the hill that bounds Plainlands of the south. He soon reached the summit and disappeared. I remained motionless. The thunder ceased, but the rain still continued, and the scene was enveloped in an impenetrable darkness. I resolved in my mind the events which I had until sought to forget. The whole train of my progress towards the creation, the appearance of my work of my own hands, alive at my bedside, its departure, 2 years and now nearly elapsed since the night on which he first received life. And was this his first crime? Alas! I turned loose into the world a deprived wretch, who was delight was in carnage and misery. Had he not murdered my brother? No one can conceive the anguish I suffered during the remainder of the night, which I spent cold and wet in the open air. But I did not feel the inconveniences of the weather. My imagination was busy in scenes of evil and despair. I considered the being whom I had cast among mankind, endowed in the will and power to effect purpose of horror, such as the deed which he had now done. Nearly in light of my own vampire, my own spirit let loose from the grave and forced to destroy all that was dear to me. Day dawned, and I directed my steps toward the town. The gates were open, and I hastened to my father's house. My first thought was to discover what I knew of the murderer, and cause instant pursuit to be made. But I paused when I reflected on the story that I had to tell. A being whom I myself had formed and endued with life had met me at midnight among the precipices on the inaccessible mountain. I remembered also the nervous fever which I had been seized just at the time that I dated my creation, which would give an air of delirium to a tale otherwise so utterly improbable. I well knew that if any other had communicated its ravings of insanity. Besides, the strange nature of the animal would elude all pursuit, even if it were so far credited to persuade my relatives to commence it. And then, of what use be pursuit? Who would arrest a creature capable of scaling the overhanging sides of Mount Slivi? These reflections demined me, and I resolved to remain silent. It was also about 5 in the morning when I entered my father's house. I told the servants not to disturb the family, and went into the library to attend their usual hour of rising. 6 years had elapsed, past as a dream, but for one indelible trance. I stood in the same place where I had last embraced my father, and before my departure for Iglis, beloved and venerable parent. He still remained to me. I gazed on the picture of my mother, which stood over the mantelpiece. It was a historical subject, painted at my father's desire, and represented Caroline Beaufort, in the agony of despair, kneeling by her coffin of her dead father. Her garb was rustic, and her cheek pale, but there was air of dignity and beauty that hardly permitted the sentiment of pity. Below this picture was a miniature of William, and my tears flowed when I looked upon it. While I was thus engaged, Ernest entered. He had heard me arrive, hastened to welcome me. He expressed a soulful delight to see me. "Welcome, my dearest Victor," said he. "Ah, I wish you could have seen 3 months ago, and then you could have found us all joyous and delighted. You come to us now to share a misery which nothing can alleviate. Yet your presence will, I hope, revive our father, who seems sinking under his misfortune. and your persuasions will induce poor Elizabeth to cease her vain and tormenting self-accusations. Poor William, he was our darling and our pride. Tears unrestrained fell from my brother's eyes. A sense of mortal agony crept over my frame. Before I had only imagined the wretchedness of my desolate home. The reality came to me as a new and not less terrible disaster. I tried to calm Ernest. I inquired more minutely concerning my father, and her I named my cousin. She, most of all, requires consolation. She accuses herself of having caused the death of my brother, and made her very wretched. But since the murderer has been discovered, the murderer discovered? Good God, how could that be? Who could attempt to pursue him? It is impossible. One might as well overtake the winds or confine a mountain stream with straw. I saw him too. He is free last night. I do not know what you mean, replied my brother in accents of wonder. But to us, the discovery we have made completes our misery. No one would believe it at first, but even now Elizabeth will not be convinced, notwithstanding all evidence. Indeed, who would credit Justin Mortgage, who was so amiable and fond of the family, would suddenly become capable of frightful, so appalling a crime? Justin Mortgage? Poor girl. Is she the accused? But it was wrongfully, everyone knows that. No one believes it, surely, Ernest. No one did at first, but several circumstances came out that have been forced conviction upon us, and her own behavior has been so confused as to add to the evidence of facts of weight that, I fear, leaves no hope for doubt. But she will be tried today, and you will then hear all. He related that the morning on which the murder poor William had been discovered, Justin had been taken ill and confused to her bed for several days. During this interval, one of the servants, happening to examine the apparel she had worn on the night of murder, had discovered in her pocket a picture of my mother, which had been judged to be the temptation of the murderer. The servant instantly showed it to the others, who, without saying a word to any of the family, went to a magistrate, and upon their deposition, Justin was apprehended, on being charged with the fact the poor girl confirmed the suspicion, in a great measure by their extreme confusion of manner. This was a strange tale, but did not shake my faith, and I replied earnestly, "Are you all mistaken? I know the murderer, Justin. Poor, good Justin is innocent." At that instant my father entered. I saw unhappiness deeply impressed on his countenance, but he and deeply impressed on his countenance, but he endeavored to exchange our mournful greeting, would have introduced some other topic, that then our disasters. Had not Ernest exclaimed, "Good God, Papa, Victor says that he knows who the murderer of poor William." "We do also, unfortunately," replied my father, "for indeed I have rather been forever ignorant to have dissolved so much depravity and ingratitude in one I value so highly. My dear father, you are mistaken. Justine is innocent. If she is, God forbid that she should suffer as guilty. She is to be tried today, and I sincerely hope that she will be acquitted." This speech calmed me, and I was firmly conceived in my own mind that Justine, an indeed very human being, was guiltless of this murder. I had no fear, therefore, that any circumstantial evidence could be brought forward strong enough to convict her. My tale was not one to be announced publicly. Its astounding horror would be looked upon as madness by the vulgar. Did anyone indeed exist except I, their creator, who would believe unless the senses convinced him, in the existence of the living monument of presumption and rash ignorance which I had let loose upon the world? We were soon joined by Elizabeth. Time had altered her since last I beheld her. It has endowed her with loveliness surpassed the beauty of her childish years. There was the same candor, the same vivacity, but it was all allied to an expression more full of sensibility and intellect. She welcomed me with the greatest affection. "Your arrival, my dear cousin," said she, "fills me with hope. You perhaps will find some means to justify my poor guiltiness, Justin. Alas, who is safe? If she be convicted of crime, I rely on her innocence as certainly as I do upon my own. Our misfortune is doubly hard to us. We have not only lost that lovely, darling boy, but this poor girl, whom I sincerely love, is to be torn away by even a worse fate. If she is condemned, I never shall know joy more. But she will not. I am sure she will not. And then I shall be happy again, even after the sad death of my little William. She is innocent, my Elizabeth, said I, and that shall be proven. Fear nothing, and let your spirits be cheered by the assurance of her acquittal. How kind and generous you are! Everyone else believes in her guilt, and that made me wretched, for I knew that it was impossible, and to see everyone else prejudged so deadly a manner rendered me hopeless and despairing. She wept. Dearest niece, said my father, dry your tears. If she is, as you believe, innocent, rely on the justice of our laws, and activity at which I shall prevent the slightest shadow of parlity. Chapter 8. We passed a few sad hours until 11 o'clock, when the trial was to commence. My father and the rest of the family being obligated to attend as witnesses, I accompanied them to the court. During this whole of this wretched mockery of justice, I suffered living torture. It was to be decided whether the result of my curiosity and lawless devices would cause the death of two of my fellow beings. One a smiling baby full of innocence and joy, the other far more dreadfully murdered with every aggravation of infamy that could make the murder memorable in horror. Justin also was a girl of merit and possessed qualities which promised to render her life happy. Now all was to be obliterated in the abomination's grave, and I the cause. 1,000 times rather would I have confessed myself guilty of the crime ascribed to Justin, but I was absent when it was committed, and such a declaration would have been considered as ravings of a madman, who would have expulted her who suffered through me. The appearance of Justin was calm. She was dressed in mourning, and her countenance, always engaging, was rendered, by the sublimity of her feelings, exquisitely beautiful, yet she appeared confident in innocence, and did not tremble, although gazed on and execrated by thousands, for all the kindness which her beauty might otherwise have excited was obliterated in the minds of the spectators by the imagination of the enormity she was supposed to have committed. She was tranquil, yet her tranquillity was evidently constrained, as her confusion had been before adduced as proof of her guilt. She worked up her mind to an appearance of courage. When she entered the court, she threw her eyes round it, and quietly discovered where we were sat. A tear seemed to dim her eye when she saw us, but she quickly recovered herself, and a look of sorrowful affection seemed to attest her utter guiltness. The trial began, and after the advocate against her had stated the charge, several witnesses were called. Several strange facts combined against her, which might have staggered anyone who had not proof of her innocence as I had. She had been out the whole of the night on which the murder had been committed, and towards morning had been preceded by a market woman, not far from the spot where the body of the murdered child had been found afterwards. The woman asked her what she did there, but she looked very strangely and only returned a confused and unintelligible answer. She returned to the house about 8 o'clock, and when one inquired where she had passed the night, she replied that she had been looking for the child, and demanded earnestly that if anything had been heard concerning him. When shelling the body, she fell into violent hysterics, and kept her bed for several days. The picture was when produced which the servant had found in her pocket, and when Elizabeth, in a faltering voice, proved that it had been the same which, an hour before the child had been missed, she placed around his neck. A murmur of horror and indignation filled the court. Justin was called on for her defense. As the trial had proceeded, her countenance had altered. Surprise, horror, and misery were strongly expressed. Sometimes she struggled with her tears, but when she was desired to plead, she collected her powers and spoke in an audible, although variable voice. God knows, she said, how entirely I am innocent, but I do not pretend that my protestations should acquire me. I rest my innocence on a plain and simple explanation the facts which have been adduced against me, and I hope the character I have always borne will incline my judges to a favorable interpretation, where any circumstance appears doubtful or suspicious. She then relates that, by permission of Elizabeth, she had passed the evening of the night on which the murder had been committed at the house of an aunt at Chilvey, a village situated about a league from Geneva. On her return, about 9 o'clock, she met a man who asked her if she had seen anything of a child who lost. She was alarmed by this account, and passed several hours looking for him. When the gates of Geneva were shut, and she was forced to remain several hours at a light in a barn belonging to a cottage, being unwilling to call up the inhabitants, to whom she was well known. Most of the night she spent here watching. Towards the morning, she believed that she slept for a few minutes. Some steps disturbed her, and she woke. It was dawn, and she quitted her asylum, and she might again endeavor to find my brother. If she hadn't gone near the spot where his body lay, it was without her knowledge. That she had been bewildered when questioned by the market woman, it was not surprising, since she had passed a sleepless night, and the fate of poor William was yet uncertain. Concerning the picture she could give no account. I know, continued the unhappy victim, how heavenly and fatally this one circumstance weighs against me, but I have no power of explaining it, and when I have expressed my utter ignorance, I am only left to conjecture concerning the probabilities by which it might have been placed in my pocket. But here also I am checked. I believe that I have no enemy on earth, and none surely would have been so wicked to destroy me wantonly. Did the murderer place it there? I know of no opportunity afforded him for doing so. If I had, why shouldn't he have stolen the jewel to part with it again so soon? My cause to the justice of my judges. Yet I see no room for hope. I beg permission to have a few witnesses examined concerning my character, and if their testimony shall not overweigh my supposed guilt, I must be condemned, although I should pledge my salvation on my innocence. Several witnesses were called, who had known her for many years, and they spoke well of her, but fear and hatred of the crime of which they supposed her guilty rendered them timorous and unwilling to come forward. Elizabeth saw even in this last resource her excellent dispositions and irresponsible conduct about to fail. She accused, when although violently agitated, she desired permission to address the court. I am, said she, the cousin of the unhappy child who was murdered, or rather his sister, for I was educated and have lived with his parents ever since long before his birth. It may, therefore, be judged indecent in me to come forward on this occasion, but when I see a fellow creature about to perish through the cowardice of her pretended friends, I wish to be allowed to speak, that I may say what I know of her character. I am well acquainted with the accused. I have lived in the same house with her at one time for 5 and yet another nearly 2 years. During all that period, she appeared to me the most amiable and benevolent of human creatures. She nursed Madame Frankenstein, my aunt, in her last illness with the greatest affection and care, and afterwards attended her own mother during the tenderness illness in a manner that excited the admiration of all who knew her. After which she again lived in my uncle's house, where she was beloved by all the family. She was warmly attached to the child, who is now dead, and acted towards him like a most affectionate mother. For my own part, I do not hesitate to say that, notwithstanding all the evidence produced against her, I believe and rely on her perfect innocence. She had no temptation for such an action. As to the babble on which the chief proof rests, if she had earnestly desired it, I should have willingly given it to her, so much to esteem and value her. A murmur of approbation followed Elizabeth's simple and powerful appeal, but it was excited by her generous interference, and not in favor of poor Justin, of whom the public indignation was turned, with renewed violence, charging her with the blackest ingratitude. She herself wept as Elizabeth spoke, but she did not answer. My own agitation and anguish was extreme during the whole trial. I believed in her innocence. I knew it. Could the demon who had, I did not for a minute doubt, murmured murdered my brother also in his hellish sport, have betrayed the innocents to death in ignominy, I couldn't have sustained the horror of my situation, and when I perceived that the popular voice and the countenances of just judges had already commended my unhappy victim, I rushed out of the court in agony. The tortures of the accused did not equal mine. She was sustained by innocence, but the fangs of the remorse tore my bosom, and would not forego their hold. I passed the night in unmingled wretchedness. In the morning, I went to the court. My lips and throat were parched. I dare not ask the fatal question, but I was known, and the officer guessed the cause of my visit. The ballots had been thrown. They were all black, and Justin was condemned. I cannot pretend to describe what I felt then. I have before experienced sensations of horror, and I endeavored to bestow upon them adequate expressions, but words cannot convey the idea of heart-sickening despair that I then endured. The person to whom I addressed myself added that Justin had already confessed her guilt. That evidence, he observed, was hardly required in so glaring a case, but I am glad of it, and indeed none of our judges like to condemn a criminal upon circumstantial evidence, be it ever so decisive. This was strange and unexpected intelligence. What could it mean? Had my eyes deceived me, and was I really as mad as the whole world would believe me to be if I disclosed the object of my suspicions? I hastened to return home, and Elizabeth eagerly demanded the result. My cousin, replied I, it was decided, as you may have expected, all judges, rather than 10 innocent should suffer, than one guilty should escape. But she has confessed. This was a dire blow to poor Elizabeth, who had relied with firmness upon Justin's innocence. Alas, said she, how shall I ever again believe in human goodness? Justin, who I loved and esteemed as my sister, how could she put on those smiles of innocence, only to betray? Her mild eyes seemed incapable of any severity or guile, and yet she committed a murder. Soon after, we heard that a poor victim had expressed a desire to see my cousin. My father wished her not to go, but said he left it to her own judgment, if he likes to decide. Yes, said Elizabeth, I will go, although she is guilty, and you, Victor, shall accompany me. I cannot go alone. The idea of this visit was torture to me, yet I could not refuse. We entered the gloomy prison chamber and beheld Justin, sitting on some straw on the further end. Her hands were manacled, and her head rested on her knees. She rose on seeing us enter, and when we were left alone with her, she threw herself at the feet of Elizabeth, weeping bitterly. My cousin wept also. Oh, Justin, said she, why did you rob me of my last consolation? I relied on your innocence, and although I was then very wretched, I was not so miserable as I am now. And do you also believe that I am so very, very wicked? Do you also join my enemies to crush me, to condemn me to it as a murderer? Her voice was suffocated with sobs. Rise, my poor girl, said Elizabeth. Why do you kneel if you are innocent? I am not one of your enemies. I believe you guiltless, notwithstanding every evidence, until I heard that you had yourself declared your guilt. The report you say is false, and be assured, dear Justin, that nothing can shake my confidence in you for a moment, but your own confession. I did confess, but I confessed a lie. I confessed that I might obtain absolution, but now that falsehood lies heavier at my heart than all my other sins. The God of heaven forgive me. Ever since I was condemned, my confessor has besieged me. He threatened and menaced until I almost began to think that I was a monster that he said I was. He threatened excommunication and hellfire in the last moments if I continued obdurate. Dear lady, I had none to support me. All looked at me as if I was a wretched doomed to ignominy and perdition. What could I do? In an evil hour I subscribed to a lie, and now only I am truly miserable. She paused, weeping, and then continued, I thought with horror, my sweet lady, that you should believe your Justin, whom you blessed on, had so highly honored, and whom you loved, as a creature capable of a crime which none but the devil himself could have perpetrated. Dear William, dearest blessed child, I shall soon see you again in heaven, where we shall all be happy, and that consoles me, willing as I am, to suffer injury and death. Oh, Justin, forgive me for having for one moment distrusted you. Why did you confess? But do not mourn, dear girl. Do not fear. I will proclaim. I will prove your innocence. I will melt the stony hearts of your enemies. By my tears and prayers, you shall not die. You, my playfellow, my companion, my sister, perish on the scaffold. No, no. I never could survive so horrible a misfortune. Justin shook her head mournfully. I do not fear to die, said she. That pang is past. God raises my weakness and gives me courage to endure the worst. I leave a sad and bitter world, and if you remember me and think of me as one unjustly condemned, I am resigned to the fate awaiting me. Learn from me, dear lady, to submit in practice to the will of heaven. During this conversation, I had retired to a corner of the prison room, where I could conceal the horrid anguish that possessed me. Despair! Who dare talk of that? The poor victim, who, on the morrow, was to pass the unlawful boundary between life and death, felt not, as I did, such deep and bitter agony. I gashed my teeth and ground them together, uttering a groan that came from my inmost soul, just in starting. When she saw who it was, she approached me and said, Dear sir, you are very kind to visit me. You, I hope, do not believe that I am guilty. I could not answer, No, Justin, said Olivia. He is more convinced of your innocence than I was, for even when he heard that you confessed, he did not credit it. I truly thank him in these last moments. I feel the sincerest gratitude towards those who think me with kindness. How sweet is the affection of others to such a wretch I am! It removes more than half my misfortune, and I feel as if I could die in peace, now that my innocence is acknowledged by you, dear lady, and your cousin. Thus the poor sufferer tried to comfort the others herself. She, indeed, gained the resignation she desired, but I, the true murderer, felt never dying worm alive in my bosom, which allowed of no hope of consolation. Elizabeth also wept, and was unhappy, but hers was also with the misery of innocence, which, like a cloud that passes over the fair moon, for a while hides that cannot tarnish its brightness. Anguish and despair had penetrated into the core of my heart. I bore a hell within me, which nothing could extinguish. We stayed several hours with Justin, and it was with great difficulty that Elizabeth could tear herself away. I wish, cried she, that I were to die with you. I could not live in this world of misery. Justin assumed the air of cheerfulness, while she with difficulty repressed her bitter tears. She embraced Elizabeth, and said in a voice of half-suppressed emotion, Farewell, sweet lady, dearest Elizabeth, my beloved and only friend. May heaven in its bounty bless and preserve you. May this be the last misfortune that you will ever suffer. Live and be happy, and make others so. And on the morrow Justin died. Elizabeth's heart rendered equals failed to prove the judges for their settled conviction in the criminality of the saintly sufferer. My passionate and indignant appeals were lost upon them, and when I received their cold answers and heard the harsh, unfeeling reasoning of these men, my purpose and will died away on my lips. Thus I might proclaim myself a madman, but not revoke the sentence passed upon my wretched victim. She perished on the scaffold as a murderess. From the tortures of my own heart, I turned to contemplate the deep and voiceless grief of my Elizabeth. This also was my doing, and my father's woe, and the desolation of that late so smiling home. All was the work of my thrice accursed hands. Ye weep, unhappy ones, but these are not your last tears. Again shall you raise the funeral well, and sound of your lamentation shall again and again be heard. Frankenstein, your son, your kinsman, your early and beloved friend, he who would spend each vital drop of blood for your sakes, who was not thought nor sense of joy exception, as it mirrored also in you, dear commence, who would fill the air with blessings and spent his life in serving you. He bids you weep, to shed countless tears, happy beyond his hopes, if thus inexorable fate be satisfied, and if the destruction pause before the peace of the grave have succeeded to your sad torments. Thus spoke my prophet soul, as torn by remorse, horror, and despair. I beheld those I loved spent vain sorrow upon the graves of William and Justin, the first hapless victim to my unhallowed arts. Chapter 9. Nothing is more painful to the human mind than after the feeling have been worked up by the quick succession of events. The dead calmness of inaction, and certainly with fellows and deprives the soul both of hope and fear. Justin died, she rested, and I was alive. The blood flowed freely in my veins, but a weight of despair and remorse pressed on my heart, which nothing could remove. Sleep fled from my eyes. I wandered like an evil spirit, for I had committed deeds of mischief beyond description horrid. And much more, I persuaded myself, was yet behind. Yet my heart overflowed with kindness and the love of virtue. I had begun myself with benevolent intentions, and thirst for the moment when I should put them in practice, and make myself useful to my fellow beings. Not all was lasting. Instead of that sincerity of conscience which allowed me to look back upon the past with self-satisfaction, and from thence gather promise of new hopes, I was seized by remorse and a sense of guilt, which hurried away from me to a hell of intense tortures, such as no language can describe. This mind of state preyed upon my health, which had perhaps never entirely recovered from the first shock had sustained. I shunned the face of man. All sign of joy or complacency was torture to me. Solitude was my only consolation. Deep, dark, death-like solitude. My father observed with pain the alteration perceptible in my disposition, the habits and endeavored by arguments deduced from the feelings of a sincere conscience and guiltless life to inspire me with fortitude and awaken in me the courage to dispel dark cloud which brooded over me. Do you think, Victor, said he, that I do not suffer also? Not one could love a child more than I loved your brother. Tears came into his eyes as he spoke. But it is not a duty to the survivors that we should refrain from augmenting their unhappiness by appearance of immoderable grief. It is also a duty unto yourself, for excessive sorrow prevents improvement or enjoyment, or even discharge of daily usefulness, without which no man is fit for society. This advice, although good, was totally inacceptable to my case. I should have been the first to hide my grief, and console my friends if remorse had not mingled its bitterness. The terror is alarm, which my other sensations now could only answer my father with a look of despair and endeavour to hide myself from his view. Although this time we retired to the house at Belrive, this change was particularly agreeable to me. The shutting of the gates regularly at 10 o'clock, and the impossibility of remaining on the lake after that hour, had rendered our residence within the halls of Genua very irksome to me. I was now free. Often, after the rest of the family had retired for the night, I took the boat and passed many hours upon the water. Sometimes, with my sail set, I was carried by the wind, and sometimes, after rowing to the middle of the lake, I left the boat to pursue its own course, and gave way to my most miserable reflections. I was often tempted, when all was peace around me, and I was the only unquieted thing that wandered restless in a scene so beautiful and heavenly. If I excepted some bat or the frogs, whose harsh and interrupted croaking was heard only when I approached the shore, often, I say, I was tempted to plunge into the silent lake, that waters might close over me in my calamities forever. But I was restrained. When I thought of the heroic and suffering Elizabeth, whom I tenderly loved, and whose existence was bound up in mine, I thought also of my father and surviving brother. Should I, by base of desertion, leave them exposed and unprotected to the malice of the fiend whom I had left loose among them? At these moments I wept bitterly, and wished that peace would revisit my mind, only that I may afford them consolation and happiness. But that cannot be. Remorse extinguished every hope, and I had been the author of unalterable evils, and I lived in daily fear lest the monster whom I had created should penetrate some new wickedness. I had obscure feelings that all was not over, and that he would still commit some single crime, which, by its enormity, should almost affect the recollection of the past. There was always scope for fear, so long as many things I beloved remained behind. My abhorrence of this fiend cannot be conceived. When I thought of him, I gashed my teeth, my eyes became inflamed, and I apparently wished to extinguish that life which I had so thoughtlessly bestowed. When I reflected on his crimes and malice, my hatred and revenge burst all bounds of moderation. I could have made a pilgrimage to the highest peak of Andres, could I, when there, have capacited him to their base. I wished to see him again, that I might wreak havoc the uttermost extent of abhorrence on his head, and avenge the deaths of William and Justin. Our house was the house of mourning. My father's health was deeply shaken by the horror of the recent events. Elizabeth was sad and despondent. She no longer took delight in her ordinary occupations. Her pleasure seemed her sacrilege toward the death. Eternal woe and tears, she then thought, as she just tributed should pay incense so blasted and destroying. She was no longer that happy creature who in early youth wandered with me on the banks of the lake, talked with chastity of her future prospects. The first of these sorrows, which are sent to wean us from the earth, had visited her, and its dimming influence quenched their dearest smiles. When I reflected, my dear cousin, said she, on the miserable death of Justin Bordes, I no longer see the world as it works as they before appeared to me. Before I look upon the accounts of vice and injustice that I read in books or heard from tales of ancient days or imaginary evils. At least they were remote and more familiar to reason than the imagination, but now misery has come home. Men appear to me as monsters thirsting for each other's blood. Yet I am certainly unjust. Everybody believes that poor girl to be guilty, and if she had committed the crime for which she suffered, certainly she would have been the most depraved of human creatures. For the sake of you, Jules had murdered the son of her benefactor and friend, a child whom she had nursed from its birth, and appeared to love as if it had been her own. I could not consent to the death of any human being, but certainly I should have thought such a creature unfit to remain in the society of men. But she was innocent. I feel she was innocent. You are the same opinion, and that confirms me. Alas, Victor, when falsehood can look so like truth, who can assure themselves of certain happiness? I feel as if I were walking on the edge of a precipice towards which thousands are crowding, and invite me to plunge into abyss. William and Justin are assassinated, and the murderer escapes. He walks about the world free, and perhaps respected, but even if I were condemned to suffer on the scaffold for the same crimes, I would not change places with such a wretch. I listened to this discourse with the extremest agony. I, not indeed, but in effect, was the true murderer. Elizabeth read my anguish in my countenance, and kindly taking my hand, said, "My dearest friend, you must calm yourself. These events have affected me, God knows how deeply, but I am not so wretched as you are. There is an expression of despair, sometimes revenge, in your countenance, that makes me tremble. Dear Victor, banish these dark passions. Remember the friends around you, who center their hopes in you. Have we lost the power of rendering you happy? Ah, while we love, while we are true to each other, here in this land of peace and beauty, your native country, we may reap every tranquil blessing. What can disturb our peace? And could not such words from her whom I fondly prized, before every other gift of fortune sufficed to chase away the fiend that lurked in my heart? Even as she spoke, I drew near to her, as if in terror, lest at that very moment the destroyer had been very near to rob me of her. Thus not the tenderness of friendship, nor the beauty of earth, nor of heaven, could redeem my soul from woe. The very accents of love were ineffectual. I was encompassed by a cloud which no beneficial influence could penetrate. The wounded deer dragging its fainting limbs to some untrodden brake. There was to gaze upon the arrow which had pierced it, and to die, but a type of me. Sometimes I could cope with the sullen despair that overwhelmed me, but sometimes the whirlwind passions of my soul drove me to speak. The bodily exercise my change of place, some relief from my intolerable sensations. It was during an access of this kind that I suddenly left my home, and bending my steps toward the weird alpine valleys, sought in magnificence the eternity of such scenes to forget myself, and infernal because human sorrows. My wanderings were directed towards the valley of Gurix. I had visited it frequently during my boyhood. 6 years had passed then. I was a wreck, but not that change in those savage and enduring scenes. I performed the first part of my journey on horseback. I afterwards hired a mule, as the more sure-footed and least liable to receive an injury on these rugged roads. The weather was fine. It was about middle of month of August, nearly 2 months after the death of Justin, that miserable epoch from which I dated all my woe. The weight upon my spirit was sensibly lightened as I plunged yet deeper into the ravine of Evray. The immense mountains and prejudices that hung over me every side and sound of river raging among the rocks and dashing of waterfalls around spoke of a power mighty as omnipotence, and I ceased to fear or to bend before any being less almighty than that which created the ruled the elements, here displayed their most terrific guise. Still I ascended higher. The valley assumed more magnificent and astonishing character. Ruined castles hanging on precipices of piney mountains, the imperious army cottages every here and there peeping forth from among the trees, formed a scene of singular beauty. It was augmented and rendered sublime in mighty Alps, whose white and shining pyramids and domes towered above all, as belonging to other earth, the habitations of other race of beings. I passed the bridge of Pezier when the ravine which the river forms opened before me, and I began to ascend the mountain that overhangs it. Soon after I entered the valley of Cormix. This valley was more wonderful and sublime, but not so beautiful in picture as that of Servox, though which I had just passed. The high and snowy mountains were its immediate boundaries, and I saw no more ruined castles and fertile fields. Immense glaciers approached the road. I heard the rumbling thunder of falling avalanche mark the smoke of its passage. Mont Blanc and the supreme and magnificent Mount Blanc raised itself from the surrounding Alleghes, and its tremendous dome overlooked the valley. A tingling, lost long sense of pleasure often came across me during this journey. Some turn in the road, some new object, suddenly perceived the recognized reminder of days gone by, and were associated with the light-hearted gaiety of boyhood. The very winds whispered in soothing accents, and maternal nature bade me to weep no more. Then again the kindly influence ceased to act. I found myself fettered again to grief, and indulging in all the misery of reflection. Then I spurred on my animal, striving so to forget the world, my fears, and more than myself. Or, in a desperate fashion, I aligned and threw myself on the grass, weighed down by horror and despair. At length I arrived at the village of Cormix. Exhaustion succeeded to the extreme fatigue both of body and of mind which I had endured. For a short space of time I remained at the window watching the pallid lightnings and playing above Mont Blanc, listening to the rushing of Hervé, which paused its noisy way beneath. The same luring sounds acted as a lullaby to my too keen sensations. When I placed my head upon my pillow, sleep crept over me. I felt it came, and blessed the griever of oblivion. I spent the following day roaming through the valley. I stood beside sources of Avrion, which take their rise in a glacier, that which no pace is advancing toward the summit of the hills to barricade the valley. The abrupt sides of vast mountains were before me. The icy walls and glaciers overhung me. A few shattered pines were scattered round. In solemn silence of this glacierous present chamber of impure nature was broken only by the brawling waves of the fall of some vast fragment. The thunder sounded of an avalanche or crackling reverberated among the mountains of the accumulated ice, which, though the silent working of immutual laws, was ever. The Ammon ran and torn as it had been, but a plaything in their hands. These sublime and magnificent scenes afforded me the greatest consolation, that which I was capable of receiving. They elevated me from all lightness of feeling, and although they did not remove my grief, they subdued and tranquilled it to some degree. Also, they diverted my mind from the thoughts which had brooded for the last month. I retired to rest at night, my slumbers, as it were, weighted and ministered by the semblance of grand shapes which had contemplated during the day. They congregated around me, the unstained, snowy mountain top, the glittering pinnacle, the pine woods, and ragged bare ravine, the eagle soaring amidst the clouds. They all gathered round me, and bade me at peace, where they fled when the next morning I woke, all the soul-inspiring flood of sleep, and dark melancholy clouded every thought. The rain was pouring in torrents, and thick mist hid the summits of the mountains, so that I saw not faces of those mighty friends. Still, I would penetrate their misty veil, and seek them in their cloudy retreats. What were rain and storm to me? My meal was bought at the door, and I resolved to ascend to the summit of Mountain Vert. I remembered the effect on the view of a tremendous and ever-moving glacier that produced upon my mind. When I first saw it, it had filled me with the sublime ecstasy that gave wings to soul, that allowed it to soar from the obscure world to light and joy. The sight of the awful and majestic in nature, indeed always the effect of solacing my soul, and causing me to forget the passing caresses of life. I determined to go without a guile, for I was well acquainted with the path, and presence of another would destroy the solitary grandeur of the scene. The adjacent and precipitous, but the path was cut into continual and short windings, which admitted you to surmount the precipice of the mountain. It was a scene temporarily desolate. In a thousand spots traces of winter avalanche may be perceived. These trees lie broken and strewed upon the ground, some entirely destroyed, others bent, leaning upon the jutting rocks of a mountain, or transversely upon other trees. The path, as you ascend higher, is intersected by ravines of snow, down which stones continually roll from above. One of them is particularly dangerous, as the slight sound, such as even speaking in a loud voice, produces a concussion of air sufficient to draw destruction upon the head of the speaker. The pines are not tall or luxuriant, but they are summery and add to the air of severity and scene. I looked on the valley beneath. Vast mists were rising from the rivers which ran through it, and curling in thick wreaths around the opposite mountains, whose summits were hid in uniform clouds, while rain poured from the dark sky. It added to the melancholy impression I received from the object around me. Alas, why does man boast of sensibilities superior to those apparent in the brute? It only renders them more necessity. If our impulses were confined to hunger, thirst, and desire, we might be nearly free, but now we are moved by very wind that blows, and chance word or scene that may convey to us. We rest. A dream has power to poison sleep. We rise, when wandering through pollutes the day. We feel, conceive, or reason, laugh or weep, embrace fond foe, or cast our cares away. It is the same, be it for joy or sorrow. The path of its departure still is free. Man's yesterday may never be like his morrow, not may endure his mutability. It was nearly noon when I arrived at the top of the ascent. For some time I sat upon the rock that overlooks the sea of ice. I miscovered both the surrounding mountains. Presently a breeze dissipated the cloud that I descended upon the glacier. Their surface is very uneven, rising like waves of a troubled sea, descending low, interspersing by rifts that sink deep. The field of ice is almost a league in width, but I spent nearly 2 hours in crossing it. The opposite mountain is a bare, peculiar rock. From the side where I now stood, Montserrat, which is exactly opposite, at the distance of a league, and above it rose Mount Blanc, in awful majesty. I remained in the recess of the rock, gazing on this wonderful and stupendous scene. The sea, or rather the vast river of ice, wound among its departed mountains, whose aerial summits hung above its recesses. Their icy and glittering peaks shone in sunlight over the clouds. My heart, which was before sorrowful, now swelled with something like joy. I exclaimed, wandering spirits, if indeed ye wander, and do not rest on your narrow beds, allow me this faint happiness, or take me, as your companion, away from the joys of life. As I said this, I suddenly beheld the figure of a man, at some distance, racing toward me with superhuman speed. He was bounding over crevices of ice, among which I walked with caution. His stature, also, as he approached, seemed to exceed that of man. I was troubled. A mist came over my eyes, and I felt a faintness seize me. But I was quickly restored by the cold gale of the mountains. I perceived, as the shape came near, sight tremendous and horrid, that it was the wretch who I had created. I trembled with rage and horror, resolving to wait this approach. And then close with him, in mortal combat, he approached. His countenance bespoke bitter anguish, combined with disdain and malignity, while unearthly ugliness rendered it almost too horrible for human eyes, but I scarcely observed this. Rage and hatred that first deprived me of utterance. I recovered only to overwhelm him with words expressive of furious detestation and contempt. Devil, I exclaimed, do you dare approach me? I do not fear the fierce vengeance of my arm wreaked on your miserable head. Begone, vile insect, or rather stay, that I may trample you to dust. And oh, that I could, with the extinction of your miserable existence, restore those victims you have so diabolically murdered. I expected this reception, said the demon. All men hate the wretched. How, then, must I be hated, who I am miserable beyond all living things? Yet you, my Creator, detest and spurn me. Thy creature whom thou art bound by ties, only dissolved by annihilation of one of us. You propose to kill me. How dare you sport thus with life? Do your duty towards me, and I will do mine towards you and the rest of mankind. If you will comply with my conditions, I will leave them at you at peace, but if you refuse, I will glut the maw of death until it be saturated with the blood of your remaining friends. A horrid monster fiend that thou art, the tortures of hell are too mild a vengeance for thy crimes. Wretched devil, you reproach me with your creation. Come then, that I may extinguish the spark which I had so negligently bestowed. My rage was without bounds. I sprang on him, impelled by all the feelings which came arm one being against the existence of another. He easily eluded me, and said, be calm, I entreat you, and hear me before you give vent to your hatred on my devoted head. Have I not suffered enough? That you speak so increase my misery. Life, although it may be accumulation of anguish, is dear to me, and that I will defend it. Remember, thou hast made me more powerful than thyself. My height is superior to thine, my joints more supple, but I will not be tempted to set myself in opposition to thee. I am thy creature, and I will be even mild and docile to my nature, Lord and King, if thou wilt perform thy part, the which thou owest me. O Frankenstein, be not equitable to every other, and trample upon me alone, to whom thy justice and even thy chemically affection is most due. Remember that I am thy creature. I ought to be thy Adam, and I am rather the fallen angel whom thou drivest from joy for no misdeed. Everywhere I see bliss. Drivest from joy for no misdeed. Everywhere I see bliss, from which I alone am irreverently excluded. I am benevolent and good. Misery made me a friend, made me happy, and shall I be virtuous? Begone, I will not hear you. There can be no community between you and me. We are enemies. Begone, or let us try our strength in a fight in which one must fall. How can I move thee? I will no entice cause thee to turn a favorable eye upon thy creature, who implores thy goodness and compassion. Believe me, Frankenstein, I was benevolent. My soul glowed with love and humanity. But I am not alone. Miserable alone? You, my Creator, adore me. What hope can I gather from your fellow creatures who owe me nothing? They spurn and hate me. The desert mountains, dreary glaciers are my refuge. I have wandered there many days. Caves of ice, which I only do not fear, are dwelling to me. The only one which man does not grudge. These bleak skies I hail, for they are kinder to me than your fellow beings. If the multitude of mankind knew of my existence, they would do as you do, arm themselves for my destruction. Shall I not then hate them who abhor me? I will keep no terms with my enemies. I am miserable and shall share my wretchedness. Yet it is your power to recompose me, and deliver from an evil which it only remains for you to make so great, and not only you and your family, by thousands of others shall be showed up in the wounds of its rage. Let your compassion be moved, and do not disdain me. Listen to my tale, and you should have heard, abandon or consecrate me, as you shall judge that I deserve. But hear me. The guilty are allowed, by human laws, bloody as they are, to speak in their own defense, before you condemn. Listen to me, Frankenstein. You accuse me of murder, and yet you would, with satisfied conscience, destroy your own creature. O praise the eternal justice of man. Yet I ask you not to spare me. Listen to me, and then, if you will, and if you can, destroy the work of your hands. Why do you call to my remembrance, I rejoined, circumstances in which I shudder to reflect, that I have been miserable origin and author? Cursed be the day, or horrid devil, in which you first saw it. Cursed, although I cursed myself, by the hands that formed you. I have made me wretched beyond expression. You have left me no power to consider whether I am just to you or not. Begone, relieve me from the sight of your detested form. Thus I relieve thee, my Creator, he said, and placed his hated hands before my eyes, which I flung from me with violence. Thus I take from thee a sight which you abhor. Still, thou canst listen to me and grant thy compassion. By the virtues that I once possessed, I demand this from you. Hear my tale. It is long and strange, and the temperature of this place is not fitting to your fine sensations. Come to the hut upon the mountain. The sun is yet high in the heavens, before it descends to hide itself behind your snowy principles and illuminate another world. You will have heard my story, and can decide. On you it rests, whether I quit forever the neighborhood of man, and lead a harmless life, or become the scourge of your fellow creatures, and the author of your own speedy ruin. As he said this, he led the way across the ice. I followed. My heart was full, and I did not answer him, but I proceeded. I weighed the virtuous arguments that he had used, and determined at least to listen to his tale. I was partly urged by curiosity, and compassion confirmed my resolution. I had hitherto supposed him to be the murderer of my brother, and I eagerly sought a confirmation or denial of his opinion. For the first time, I also felt what the duties of a creator towards his creature were, and that I ought to render him happy before I complained his wickedness. These motives urged me to comply with his demand. We crossed the ice, therefore ascended the opposite rock. The air was cold, and the rain began to descend. We entered the hut, and the fiend with the air of exultation. I was with heavy heart and depressed spirits, but I consented to listen, and seating myself by the fire, which my odious companion lightened, he thus began his tale.